Hi, we enter into a new story today, and in fact, the longest story, the longest chapter in the entire book of Genesis, usually titled, as you can see on the right side of the screen, The Wooing of Rebekah. But there's a lot more going on, and as you can imagine, in a story that long, there's simply just a lot going on in 67 verses. So as you can see on the right side, we've been going through from chapter 22 to 20 to 25:18 what I'm calling transition tales, stories in between the binding of Isaac and the beginning of the Jacob cycle that try to put the pieces together that set us up for the next generation. And the pieces are kind of scattered at this point, as we've seen. Isaac is living in Beer Lahai Roi, and Sarah, until her death, had been living in the Hebron area, and Abraham, either alone or with his servants, are living farther south in Beersheba, as we saw last time. But now the word is coming to Abraham that the time has come to do something for his son Isaac, who, as far as we know, he may not have seen since the binding of Isaac over 20 years ago. We have no reason to think they've communicated, and no reason to know that Isaac knows that his mother is dead. He wasn't there, and we saw in the last chapter when Abraham negotiated a burial place with the Hittites, although we will see Isaac along with Ishmael when the father dies in Abraham in the next chapter 25. But for now, Abraham is on his own, and as I was noting last time, there are a number of aspects of these stories in terms of geography and naming, and we'll see some of that in this chapter, that are confusing. And older generations of scholars try to attribute that to different sources, suggesting that the pieces that didn't fit together were clumsy editorial comments that allowed people to notice the differences. But I'd like to suggest that's both a little bit anti-Jewish, assuming that ancient Jewish writers were so clumsy that modern, usually German writers in the 19th, early 20th century could see all their mistakes and call them exactly that. But that many of those German writers simply did not understand how to read Jewish writings and understand how they would fit together and what their strategies were. Which is not to say there weren't multiple sources, but somebody put it in the order we have it in the final version we have it now. So I'd like to suggest that some of those confusions are intentional to leave readers, ancient or later, including us, confused so that we can have a similar experience of the people in exile or after exile, where the questions of where home is and who we should be married to and what we're about are open questions. And so to understand that, we have to understand something about the Ezra-Nehemiah Persian situation. And nobody has done more to connect Genesis with that than Mark Brett, our friend from Australia. And I won't go through all the details of Brett's work. But simply put here, part of the issue, as we've seen in earlier texts around the question of Ezra-Nehemiah, is that the post-exilic agreement between Persia and the leaders of the new Jerusalem establishment, who would be Ezra the priest scribe and Nehemiah the Persian appointed governor, was that this elite group would not be married to foreigners, which would be a way that the Persians could control the elite and not having other influences. So a major aspect of their understanding of what the problem of exile was is that foreign women led the Israelite men astray. So it's not only xenophobic and sexist, it goes against Genesis 1, which is to say all of humanity was created in the divine image, and there's nobody who's not part of God's family. So that's part of the background, and yet we'll see in this chapter the first thing that Abraham tells the servant is, do not get us a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites. But we hear no reason for it, and that's one of the interesting elements here. In Ezra and Nehemiah, we hear the reason is, and similarly with 1 Kings, when Solomon's foreign wives are said to lead him astray, that they worship other gods, and it's other gods that are the problem and lead them away from commitment to Yahweh, and an identity centered around Yahweh that, not in the context of Genesis, but in certainly the context of exile, had what we know as the Torah, a set of texts that were instructions for not only the religious life in the Jerusalem temple rebuilt, but for daily life for ordinary people. And that was key. And so here we have Abraham, interestingly, saying, don't marry one of the local people, but go back to the place that Yahweh called me from. Even though we've not heard Yahweh say don't marry the Canaanites, but we did hear Yahweh say go from the old country. So there's a little conflict in the situation here, and unlike in chapter 12, we don't hear that Yahweh is involved in this chapter at all, despite the fact that he's named many times by Abraham and by the servant, and even by Laban, who has no reason to be mentioning Yahweh, but Yahweh is not directly in the story. Which will lead us all along to ask, is any of this really God's will, or is this another example of Abraham trying to force things the way he did with Hagar earlier and with some other examples that we've seen? So So those are some of the questions we'll have to look at as we go. There's some other aspects here, and I just want to bring this up in the larger picture. So around the question of how will the blessing be continued to the next generation, plainly it means that Isaac has to have a woman or a wife. And so there are three basic options: that he takes a local wife, and that's what I was just discussing; that Abraham himself goes back, although we're told right at the beginning he's old and well advanced in years, and so he's too old to do that. Although we'll hear immediately the servant is the oldest of his house, but we don't know how old that means. It's all relatively speaking. Abraham obviously doesn't think he's too old to go on the trip, and he's not, although we don't actually hear about how he's doing on his return. And he himself names the risk that the prospective wife will not go with him. And as we'll see as the story unfolds, it's really a huge ask that a stranger who the local people back in the old country have never met says, I have a master in a distant country that you've never been to, and I need to take one of your women back with me to that man. You'll never see her again. That's quite an ask, and we'll see how he uses rhetoric to make that happen. And the other option is to send Isaac back to Mesopotamia, which is exactly what Isaac and Rebekah do later when they send Jacob back to Mesopotamia. And I'll suggest, spoiler alert now, using the little trick that they do to get Esau mad at him, to send him away from being the mama's boy and houseboy that he was. But we'll have to get there when we get there. But the risk is that he would settle there and defeat God's plan. And so those are the three risks, and none of those have easy answers. And one really has to ask for the post-exilic audience. If they're not supposed to marry the local Canaanites, well, who are they supposed to marry? And we know that you can't just keep marrying within your family without it being a problem. We already saw at the introductory video to this section that within Abraham's family there was already a marriage of an uncle and a niece. And so that seems a little close here, but that's not exactly what Abraham doesn't suggest, although he doesn't suggest anybody in particular, as we'll see. Simply a wife from his family. So it's wide open, and we'll see how that plays out as we go. This chapter also has many connections with the first call of Abram at the time in chapter 12, and interestingly, it's ironically an almost complete reverse, to go back to the very country that Yahweh had called him out of in the first place. And there are also many other links between Genesis 24 and the Abraham-Sarah cycle, which we'll see along the way, which isn't surprising that in the last chapter of this cycle there'd be many things that connected together. Although we already saw in chapters 21 and 22 many things that connected it back to chapter 12 as well. So just many ways that the authors, or editors have spread out many threads to tie this all into a tight fabric. So that's one thing we need to be looking at. And also, our key words for this chapter is incredibly colorful because there are so many key words, and some of them are key words throughout the entire chapter, and some of them only in a section. So just for example, we'll see in this first section, which will take us a couple of videos, you can obviously see the word woman is highlighted, but maybe not so brightly because of the color. You can see land 6 times and Isaac 1 time, and in the last paragraph, we'll see Isaac 6 times and land 1 time, matching a perfect number of 7. So in the beginning, the question was back to my land, and here the question is Isaac. And those things are unlikely to be coincidental. That's often how these writers work, is by having a collection of words that remind you of a certain section. And that benefits and rewards people who read carefully. Many scholars, as we've seen in my Samuel series, people like Falkman, even counting syllables within lines and finding the number of syllables matches. So the biblical writers were not what some people think they are, or imagine they are, as kind of ignorant primitives. They were as literate and as brilliant at their aesthetic design as any modern writer could ever be. And so throughout this, we'll see words that connect all the way through, and also words that connect to a particular section. So like we see here, I will draw and drink and water as part of that scene. And we'll see, interestingly, that although it's described as a well, it'll regularly be described as a spring, as we'll see here. And he will call it a spring, which is not the same as a well, but we'll get there. And you can see many other words, including sun and camels, too. A lot about camels here, which we'll explore. And watering camels, which we'll explore as well. So one other thing as we begin to look at this, I was already naming this before, but here it is, this wooing of Rebekah, the 67 verses, longer than the flood story. And when we think about it, it's an interesting thing that it's longer than several of these stories put together. Really big chunks of the Abraham story that we think of as important stories, all put together, are less than this. So why the authors or editors thought this was so important, we'll have to figure out as we go. And then finally, before we start, this that we looked at earlier, but I want to highlight it now. We looked at it earlier around the Mamre thing in chapter 23, and here we'll look at it here, because in not a verse we'll see today, but in 24:10, the narrator will tell us that the servant set out to Aram Naharaim, the city of Nahor. But later we'll see that the city of Laban, who is the son of Nahor, is in Haran. And then we'll also see Padam Aram to the house of Bethel, which is also the same, should be the same as the city of Nahor. So these three different names for the same place, or are they the same place? When we look on the map here, we see there's a town called Haran, but Padam Aram here in all caps and Aram Naharaim in the curved arc here, referring to areas, indicating that really the makers of the map aren't exactly sure what these terms refer to. So they put them there, but we're not sure exactly how those refer. We know that the term Aram, and we'll look at it more later, is a root of Aramaic and other things, but it's not exactly clear what it means. But it's the part of a name for a number of places, and we'll have to look at that more as we go. So let's put up the key words and begin to enter into our story here. And as we'll see right in verse 2, I'll put it up now, there's a little chiasm that forms verses 2 to 9, which includes Abraham's charge of the servant and the servant's response. So it's this section here after the initial first verse, but we're only going to look at this section today. So Abraham was old, well advanced in years, and we noted last time the contrast between the description of Abraham's age here and Sarah's age at death, where we were told she was 127, and that was it. He's not dying here yet, obviously, and we'll see when he dies that he's 175, which is an important number, but we'll get there when we get there. But this is obviously a positive description, and it's used in 1 Samuel to describe Jesse, David's father, and it's used twice in Joshua to describe Joshua, so it becomes a figure of speech, old, well advanced in years, or it could be literally translated full of years, which is to highlight that his life was not cut short. And then we're told Yahweh blessed Abraham in all things, and as Wenham notes, surprisingly, this is the first time the narrator has commented on Abraham's blessed status. And the idea that he's blessed in all things makes us reconsider what things, what blessing, what does the narrator think blessing is. Many people associate blessing with wealth, and we'll see that Laban associates blessing with wealth. He sees the camels and the nose ring and the bracelets and says, "Blessed are you of Yahweh." But is that what the text has been telling us? I've been suggesting throughout that blessing from Genesis 1 forward refers to fertility, that God is interested in bringing forth life, and whether it's human life, animal life, or plant life, that blessing means fertility and more life. How blessed has Abraham been? Well, he's had 2 children come from him, only one from his wife. He has wealth, but did the wealth come from God? We saw that the 400 shekels he used to pay for the cave of Machpelah and the field and the trees, as the Hittites made him buy, came from his deals with 2 kings, with a pharaoh in Egypt and Abimelech in Gerar, who gave him silver when they returned Sarah. So those were certainly not Yahweh's will, and yet he got that silver that bought him this piece of land. So we don't have any reason to think the wealth is part of blessing, even though Laban will attribute it that way. But the narrator just leaves it there without describing it. And then we have Abraham beginning to speak here, and there's below is the chiasm you can see. So Abraham said to his servant, the oldest of his house, who had charge of all he had. And many commentators and scholars, as my note below suggests, assume this is Eleazar, who we heard of in Genesis 15, who Abraham said to Yahweh at the time, he's my heir, and so people assume that has charge of all he had equates with that. But those are not necessarily the same issues. Having charge here of it, as Joseph has of Pharaoh, does not mean it's his, and we'll be told later, first by the servant himself, although he doesn't know it, and then later by the narrator who does know it, that Abraham is going to give all things to Isaac. So we really don't know who this servant is, and as many commentators have suggested, the anonymity is important. so we don't have a specific person to name there. And so what Abraham says to him is, "Put your hand under my thigh." And there's a "please" there that's left out of the translation. And I've tried to render in the key words a more accurate translation in the New RSV, in many places a more literal one, to keep the words matched that are often translated by diverse English words. So if you're not sure about those words, you can always follow on this keywords, which I posted on the radicalbible.net website, like all the charts I post here. So put your hand under my thigh, literally to hak yerek. And yerek is always a euphemism. It may literally mean thigh, but it's also translated as loins, and we see it here in 32, 25, and 31, worth looking at there in Jacob's wrestling scene here, that the person, angel or otherwise, who was wrestling with Jacob, here it's described as struck him on the hip socket, but it's the same word yerek there, and it's put out of joint. And as we'll see in that story, if it was a dislocated hip, Jacob would not be limping, he'd be on the ground. But if he was kicked in the balls, which is what it seems to be there, he might well be limping. And that's what's important here. It may seem crude to us, but the Genesis audience would not have thought it as crude at all. They would have thought it as sacred. That Abraham's penis is the place of the covenant and the place of the very fertility what's at issue here, which is Isaac and the future generations. So to put a hand under his thigh would be to hold on to Abraham's genitals, both as an expression of trust, that to allow someone to do that is to put them in your deep trust that they wouldn't hurt you, and it's obviously intimate, but also to be holding on to the very place that is the source of God's blessing of fertility to Abraham. So an ancient expression of a trusting oath. So put your hand under my thigh here. And we see that echoes things like in Deuteronomy 7. Let's look at that here, where we're told, do not intermarry with these people. And that's the echo that will play out in Ezra and Nehemiah. You will not get a wife from the Canaanites. But there, in Deuteronomy and Ezra and Nehemiah, it says, because they will lead you astray after other gods, providing the religious justification. But we don't hear that here. I will make you swear by Yahweh, the God of heaven and earth, and that's worth paying attention to as well, because we'll see the servant will make Yahweh sound like a family god, like Abraham's family god, which will make sense to someone like Laban. There would be national gods for the Mesopotamians like Marduk and others, but there would also be local family gods. And for the Romans in Jesus' time, the same kind of issue. There would be the national gods like Zeus, Jupiter, and others like that, who are responsible for the national well-being, but there's also family and traditional inheritance gods. Although obviously the Israelites did not make statues of what were called teraphim, although we will see that Laban has those, but not until the next round in the Jacob story. So here we see this, the God of all, the God of heaven and earth, that you will not get a woman or a wife from my son, one of our keywords, from the daughters of the Canaanites, among whom I live. And we saw in the last chapter that he claimed that he lived among the Hittites, and the Hittites were also Canaanites among that group. So we're seeing all along that Abraham is acknowledging that he's living among these foreigners, like Lot did in Sodom, but not living in a city. And why? What could it be in Abraham's mind for why he shouldn't have his son marry a Canaanite? We have no reason to think that he knows anything about the kind of ideology we find in Deuteronomy, and certainly not the sort of imperial control that the Ezra and Nehemiah Persian deal suggests. He's been sent away from that. So it's just left wide open here. And we'll see the same thing the next generation, when Rebekah tells Jacob not to marry a Canaanite woman, and Esau does, and it becomes bitter to both Isaac and Rebekah. So we don't know what the reason is, other than they are just told not to. But instead we're told this. And as Sternberg notes below, before we let's look at the NRSV and then we'll look at him. The new RSV has, go to my country and my kindred. And he says, not the meaning assigned to it by most translators and exegetes. It rather forms a hendiadys, which if you're not familiar, we saw several of in the last chapter, which are two words put together that form a single idea, signifying thou shalt go to the land of my kindred/birth, or to my native land, or to my birthplace. As Amanda Mazubi here, who comes from an interesting perspective of being a black Jewish commentator, she says, in this text, the ideal wife is not so much one that shares in the bloodline as one that shares in the experience of being formed through displacement. And finally down here from Menachem Perry, whose work on this chapter is going to be very important, as we'll see, a partner of Meyer Sternberg when they were both younger. This piece is from 2007. his son will not take a wife, he will give him one from his own, and thus participate symbolically in the procreation. And we'll see that as it goes. So what does that mean? Go to my country here, el artsi ve'el moladeti, and my kindred, as one phrase. And it's the exact reverse of what we heard in chapter 12. Go from your country and your land to the land I will show you. So what is it that could be leading Abraham here in his old age, at his last act, to undo exactly what Yahweh called him to in the first place? Should we see this as positive, or should we see it as a complete reversal? That he's given up, that at this point, with both his sons gone, his wife dead, and himself isolated, that he's feeling perhaps despairing here and giving up on this. He knows his son needs a wife, but there's nothing here about bringing the son back here, is there? So it simply says, don't take my son back there, and yet he's supposed to bring him a wife to here. So we simply don't know whether Abraham's feeling positive about this or not, and he will not meet the new wife, nor will he celebrate the couple at all. So this could well be a grim duty on his part that does not have a lot of joy. So how is the servant going to do that? Before we look at that next time, let's look briefly at the distance. So he showed the map here from Beersheba up to Haran. But if we look at Google Maps, we can see just how far a distance that is. And note that it's not that Abraham has given him any kind of map. What kind of broad thing is this? Go to my birthplace. Are we supposed to understand this servant has come from Ur in the first place all the way here? Or they picked him up in Haran after Terah, Abram's father, brought him that far? He has no map, he has no Google, obviously no GPS. How is he supposed to know where to go? It's as if saying, go to my birthplace, go to California and find my relative. It doesn't even say specifically who he should go to. No names are given of places or people. And yet that's not what the servant will ask. The servant will ask about the conditions. So we don't know how old the servant is, but it's quite the long journey that Abraham will be sending him out for. And that's not what he will ask, but we'll see what he will ask next time. See you then for that. Bye-bye.